And what a week it's been for the Pittsburgh Steelers in the first week of free agency for the 2024-2025 season. The Pittsburgh Steelers added some players, they lost some players, and we'll get into all those things, including a little bit of drama before a trade. We'll get into that and much more. Please hit that like and subscribe button, ring that notification bell if you haven't done so already. With that being said, let's get into it. So the first thing I want to talk about is the trade. Diontae Johnson ended up getting traded to the Carolina Panthers for Donte Jackson, cornerback. He recently spoke with the Pittsburgh Steelers media and talked about how the Pittsburgh Steelers have been pursuing him for quite a while. Mike Tomlin was there at his LSU Pro Day back in 2018, where Jackson ran a 4.31 40. Jackson said, Coach Tomlin, he was on me a lot coming out of college, and a lot when I was getting ready to sign my second contract. He continued, I signed my second contract with the Panthers, and the Steelers were right there. The past trade deadline, they were right there, and now they're right there again. So I feel like it's meant to be. I can't even express the amount of respect and gratitude I have for this organization for not only taking the chance on me, but making me a guy that they focus on getting, that they really showed they wanted for years and years now. And I'm finally getting to be here. Some awesome words to hear from the newest member of the Pittsburgh Steelers. And by all accounts, it seems like the Pittsburgh Steelers have been wanting this guy for a while. Very, very fast guy. He's a speed guy, which is something that the Pittsburgh Steelers needed. Joey Porter Jr., last year's second-round pick, did very well in his first year as the Steelers' number one cornerback. But he does need somebody to work on the other side of him. And, when it comes to Joey Porter Jr., speed really isn't his game. He's long, lengthy, and physical, and doesn't allow the receivers to get away from him. But he's not the fastest guy in the world. When you look at some of the receivers that the Pittsburgh Steelers have to go up against in the division and in the conference, you need at least some speed back there. To get Donte Jackson in this trade, though, it did seem a little bit underwhelming, especially when you look back. Not too long ago, the Pittsburgh Steelers got a second-round pick for Chase Claypool, which turned into Joey Porter Jr. So to me, it just kind of felt like it was a little bit underwhelming. All indications were Carolina was going to drop Jackson. The Pittsburgh Steelers probably could have gotten just a few days later. And I think all indications are that he's going to rework his contract, and that way it's not so much of a cap hit for the Pittsburgh Steelers. So why all of a sudden put Diontae Johnson on the trading block and accept so little? Now, from what I understand, there was some interest in Diontae Johnson from the Kansas City Chiefs, but the Steelers didn't want to send him somewhere in conference. Well, Mark Caboli wrote in The Athletic that this wasn't a great return for a top receiver like Johnson, but the Steelers were backed into a corner. Johnson requested a trade entering the final year of his contract with no extension in sight and a $3 million roster bonus due Friday. So the Steelers needed to get him out of the building if he requested a trade immediately, which makes sense when you see the low compensation that they got back for Diontae Johnson. Now, there's also been some rumors and reports that the Steelers were also frustrated with Diontae Johnson. There's been rumors, he had a few confrontations. There was the rumor that in the 2023 game against the Jets at halftime that he had a confrontation with quarterback Mitch Trubisky. Not too long ago, he got into another confrontation with Minkah Fitzpatrick and reportedly had an altercation on the sideline with a coach. I believe a few players had to separate him, because I really didn't think that the Steelers were going to trade Diontae Johnson. Main reason is because they lost their third wide receiver in Allen Robinson, and now they lose their receiver one, leaving two huge holes. There's been some rumors there that Tyler Boyd might be joining the Pittsburgh Steelers, and I can see him being that slot guy. Apparently, he's got some interest in the Pittsburgh Steelers, and the Steelers have interest in him. I believe there's a few other teams that are in the mix, which is why he hasn't signed with anybody yet. But if he ends up coming back home to Pittsburgh, I don't think he's a wide receiver one. He's a guy I think that could fill in that slot receiver, fill in Allen Robinson's position. I think that you're going to have to look into the draft as far as who you want to have as your wide receiver filling in for Diontae Johnson, because currently I don't think the Steelers have that guy on the team. Calvin Austin is currently on the team, and when Diontae Johnson went down last year, he somewhat filled in for Diontae Johnson. He had more snaps. It was him and other receivers. Obviously, it wasn't just him by himself, but in his time there, he showed his speed and his ability to get down the field, but nothing wowed you. And I think overall he had a solid showing when he was out there, but it wasn't wide receiver one showing. So in my opinion, the wide receiver position is one of the top positions of need going into the draft. Fortunately for the Pittsburgh Steelers, this draft is a strong wide receiver class. So to wrap up the Diontae Johnson trade, Steelers are left with a wide receiver question. They end up getting a cornerback that they've wanted for a while and lose a wide receiver one and only get a trade swap in return, in my opinion. Because like I said, Donte Jackson would have been available in free agency for the Pittsburgh Steelers to go out there and grab. Now, the big news that came out early this week was, obviously, the signing of Russell Wilson. He signed a one-year deal, veteran minimum, $1.2 million, to be with the Pittsburgh Steelers. And I'll be honest with you guys. I wasn't too thrilled about the acquisition or the thought of the acquisition prior to the Pittsburgh Steelers acquiring Russell Wilson. Yeah, maybe I'm talking myself into it, or maybe I am just kind of looking at things, watching his tape and watching his film. It's maybe not as nearly as bad as one may have thought. First thing that he did was he went to Twitter and he's put up a couple of things. He changed his profile picture to one with him in a Steelers uniform and had a little video that went out with the Renegade song, and it just so happens to fade out right after the part of the song where it goes, "The jig is up, the news is out, they finally found me." I ain't gonna lie, I like that. I like that a lot. Then the Pittsburgh Steelers go and acquire, and we'll talk a little bit more about him, Patrick Queen, and he goes to social media again, congratulates him, welcomes him on being a Steeler, and then in other tweets he talks about how it was a good day to be a Steeler. Apparently, Cam Hayward had a big influence also on Russell Wilson signing with the Pittsburgh Steelers. On Good Morning Football, NFL Network's Tom Pelissero said there were a couple of strong advocates for Russell Wilson in Pittsburgh throughout the process. One of them was veteran defensive lineman Cameron Hayward, who, like Russell Wilson, is a former Walter Payton NFL Man of the Year award winner. Hayward was certainly a strong voice in the locker room, wanting Wilson brought aboard. The other was head coach Mike Tomlin, who spent a lot of time with Wilson during the visit to the team facility on Friday. Cam Hayward sits right next to Kenny Pickett. So that's going to be an interesting moment when they get back into the locker room. Man, I really wasn't on this train, to be honest with you. I was hoping the Pittsburgh Steelers were going to find more of a prototype quarterback, 6'4", 6'5", strong arm, can throw the ball down the field, sees the field well. Or the Steelers have gotten smaller ever since they've gone away from Ben Roethlisberger. Ben Roethlisberger being 6'5", about 240 pounds. Give or take a pound or two there, I'm sure. And the next possible heir apparent was Mason Rudolph, who was just a tad bit smaller than Ben Roethlisberger at 6'4". And like I said, he was the possible heir apparent because the Steelers gave him a first-round grade. During that time when the Pittsburgh Steelers acquired Mason Rudolph, Ben Roethlisberger had been hinting at retirement. So I do think that the Steelers did make a move in case Roethlisberger did decide to hang it up. After Mason Rudolph, the Pittsburgh Steelers went out and acquired Mitch Trubisky and drafted Kenny Pickett, two quarterbacks that are under 6'3". And now there is Russell Wilson, who is, I believe, registered at 5'11", 5'10", somewhere around there. But you know how those measurements are in the NFL. They can be a little bit misleading. So I had some concerns, He wasn't a guy that targeted over the middle of the field. A lot of people say it's because of his height. He holds on to the ball quite a bit, and two NFL teams have paid quite a bit of money for him not to be on their team. But at one point, Russell Wilson has won a Super Bowl, made 9 Pro Bowls, and was a Walter Payton Man of the Year award winner back in 2020. He was a captain in Seattle, so I don't think he's the worst teammate in the world. Based on what I've seen online and on Twitter from what he's put out there, it seems like he's a guy that is all in with the Pittsburgh Steelers. I like what I'm seeing. I like him reaching out to players. I like the enthusiasm that he has. So in essence, Russell Wilson has kind of grown on me a little bit. I'm excited to see what he has. As far as him being the starter or not the starter, I tend to think more than likely he's going to end up being that starter. When it comes to the Steelers, I've come to find out it's a watch what they do, not what they say kind of team. Pittsburgh Steelers talked highly of Mason Rudolph. And from my understanding, the Pittsburgh Steelers didn't even give him an offer until after the deal was made with Russell Wilson. So now the Steelers want it out there that Kenny Pickett, it's his job to lose. And that's the narrative that they want out for now. And I understand that that's probably what's going to be the narrative going into training camp. But like in 2021, when it was Mason Rudolph, Kenny Pickett, and Mitch Trubisky, I highly doubt there's going to be any real competition. Russell Wilson had other suitors other than the Pittsburgh Steelers. And even if he wasn't given an opportunity to start, or every opportunity that he went to was merely a backup position, why wouldn't he decide to be the NFL's backup, so to speak, by leaving himself open for an opportunity for a position if and when a quarterback goes down? Because if you go back and look at last year, quarterbacks went down all over the place. In the AFC North, only Lamar Jackson started the year and ended the year. He's going to get paid $39 million anyways, by putting himself in a competition where it is the other person's job to lose, right? That's the other thing. From what I understand, this isn't really an open competition. It's Kenny Pickett's job to lose. By putting himself in a position where it's somebody else's job to lose, regardless of his history of being injured, if he don't get hurt, and there's injuries with other quarterbacks, Russell Wilson is really putting himself in a pickle there by missing out on those opportunities to become a starting quarterback, to resurrect his career. Like I said, he's getting paid no matter what. If he goes to a place where he's not the guy and there's a competition and he ends up not winning that job, what is that going to do for his future? Especially since he's behind the eight ball right now, given the fact that supposedly it's Kenny Pickett's job to lose. I just don't see that happening. But, I could be wrong. I think a big indicator is going to be when training camp starts, who ends up taking the first snaps. Because in OTAs, what can you really do to win a job? There's no contact. There's no real anything. There's no real football being played. So how can somebody beat out one other person or have anything in OTAs? So to me, it's when training camp starts. That's when it matters. Who's going to be quarterback one when training camp starts? Now, let's just go back to OTAs or even training camp. I think it means more if that person is Kenny Pickett, then I think that there is the opportunity that this is going to be an open competition. If it's Russell Wilson, then there really isn't any competition. So overall, I think that acquiring Russell Wilson, losing Mason Rudolph to Tennessee at $3 million a year, something that the Pittsburgh Steelers could have paid Mason. Yeah, they probably could have matched his deal and not signed Russell Wilson, and I'm pretty sure he would have ended up being back with the Pittsburgh Steelers, even if he was not promised the real opportunity for the number one gig to be the backup. I think he would have stayed. I think there would have been a chance for that. But like I said, watch what they do. Not what they say. So after Russell Wilson, the next accusation that the Pittsburgh Steelers got was Cameron Johnston, punter, who's recently with the Houston Texans, had punted also with the Philadelphia Eagles. So he's a guy that has punted in the elements, so to speak. The guy averages over 47 yards per punt, which is 4 more than what Presley Harvin has averaged his career. But for me, I think it was time for the Pittsburgh Steelers to get a new punter when the guy without a hamstring out-punted him. When that happened, I just felt like, this guy is not NFL punter quality. He's not nearly as consistent as he needs to be, and the weather affects him way too much than it should. Maybe perhaps if he can get an opportunity in a southern state or a dome type of place. But even at that, he'd probably prefer to go play somewhere south, just because if he's playing in a dome north, like let's just say Minnesota, there's a lot of traveling that Minnesota has to do to Green Bay, to Chicago, that aren't in a dome. And I wish the best for Harvin. You never want to wish anything bad against anybody. It just wasn't his time for the Pittsburgh Steelers. And the only thing that I can hope from when it comes to Cameron Johnson is that he'll be consistent and flip some fields. You know what I mean? That was one of the things that the Pittsburgh Steelers just weren't having the luxury of. Our defense was doing great things at times when they were healthy, and they just kept getting hindered not only by the offense, but also having to deal with shorter fields because the punter shanked a punt. Welcome on board, Cameron Johnston. Hopefully you stay consistent. So the Steelers had gotten Russell Wilson, then they got the punter. So at this point, they really didn't spend much money. The first day of free agency had ended, and I think there was a lot of people that were sitting wondering, maybe the Steelers aren't going to do as much as we thought this year. And then they come in with a big surprise, and the Pittsburgh Steelers acquire Patrick Queen, formerly of the hated Baltimore Ravens, for 3 years, $41 million, with only his first year guaranteed. Amazing deal. This guy was about looking at getting somewhere around $17-18 million a year. And instead he signs for 14, 13, somewhere around there a year. And I know there's been a lot of question of his success because Roquan Smith was acquired by the Baltimore Ravens. And that's when Patrick Queen started to come alive, so to speak. You know how people say that Alex Highsmith is a product of having TJ Watt on the other side, and that when TJ Watt isn't on the other side, he doesn't get the sacks or whatever. That's kind of been the stigma that's followed Patrick Queen when it comes to Roquan Smith. Me, for one, I think that Patrick Queen is a fantastic linebacker, and regardless of who was next to him, he was going to have success. He's a fast guy. He's young. He's 24 years old. So he had a lot of learning to do in growing up the first couple of years, and he's had some leaps in his most recent years, which are things that you should expect. But just in case it was a situation where his play on the field was a product of being lined up next to Roquan Smith, the Pittsburgh Steelers have an out next year or the year after if they'd want. Like I said, only the first year is guaranteed. But I have a feeling this guy is going to end up being a Steeler for a while. He's got the speed and coverage ability. He's the dynamic player at the middle linebacker position that the Pittsburgh Steelers have been looking for since the injury to and the loss of Ryan Shazier. I really like this one. This one's probably my favorite pickup thus far for the Steelers. I thought they were going to get a middle linebacker. I was thinking that Patrick Queen was out of budget. So I was looking at Devin White and Willie Gay and Jerome Baker. And so I was pleasantly surprised when the Steelers ended up signing Patrick Queen. I think that was the biggest splash of the free agency thus far. So now the Pittsburgh Steelers got some players at every level. You have TJ Watt up front. Also Cam Hayward. I think he still has something in the tank. Now you have Patrick Queen probably lined up next to Landon Roberts, who really showed up last year, even with the injury. Now, I think the Steelers still need to get another guy. Landon Roberts got hurt once he started to become more of the full-time guy when Quan Alexander and Cole Holcomb went down. He played through it. I mean, he's a tough son of a gun, but he's getting up there in age, and a 17-game season. I think the Steelers probably still need to get another guy there in the middle. But having Patrick Queen there, and then you have Minka Fitzpatrick in the back end. So at every level, you have, in my opinion, stars. This should equate, if the Pittsburgh Steelers can stay healthy, a very, very good defense. And speaking of one of those stars on the defense, Minka Fitzpatrick, I think he's going to get some much needed help. The Pittsburgh Steelers signed Deshaun Elliott, safe recently with the Miami Dolphins. He was also the 6th-round pick for the Baltimore Ravens in 2018. Where he spent 4 seasons before, and over to Detroit for a year before landing with the Miami Dolphins last year. Earlier in his career, he played mainly as a free safety, but over the last couple of seasons, he's moved around and logged a lot of snaps as a box safety and a slot corner as well. He's a bigger guy, 6'2", about 215 pounds or so. So I think he's a guy that's going to be replacing Minka in the box. He's a hard hitter. There's a clip out there of him hitting Derrick Henry impressively. Go check it out. Go look for it. In fact, you know what? I'll pin it in my Twitter. Go find my Twitter at State of Steelers. So I think he helps out the Steelers in multiple ways. He can end up being that big hitter in the box, that guy that can help out with the run. And he also allows Minka Fitzpatrick to be the deep hawk safety up until last year, where he's been more in the box. I think this is a great move. It helps out the defensive back room. It's a position of need, and it also puts Minka Fitzpatrick, in my opinion, in a better position in his most productive role. The Steelers still have diontae Casey, and with these guys, they can utilize that 3 safety set that they've been wanting to deploy. So all in all, so far, they have targeted quite a bit of needs. They've targeted the cornerback position, the safety position, middle linebacker position, quarterback position. They now have bigger holes in the wide receiver room. And like I said, in a draft, wide receiver is a strong group. I think the Pittsburgh Steelers will be all right. I wouldn't be surprised if the Steelers end up getting Tyler Boyd. He ends up being that slot receiver that the Steelers have needed. He's a physical guy. He's a guy I think that the Steelers would like in the locker room. He called out the Steelers when he was a member of the Bengals. Can you imagine what kind of calling out he would do if there was needing of calling out if he was in the locker room? I think he'd keep the wide receiver room in shape, especially if the Pittsburgh Steelers need to acquire a young receiver in the draft. As of right now, that young receiver would be looking up to George Pickens. And I'm not too certain if that's what you want out of 2 young receivers, for them to be looking up at each other, where there's possibly some maturity issues. So bringing in a guy like Tyler Boyd actually does kind of make more sense. So I wouldn't be surprised if we hear this. It may have already happened by the time you're listening to this podcast. Please hit that like and subscribe button. I thank you for tuning in with me. Ring that notification bell if you haven't already done so. We'll be back with more breaking news as they come along. That being said, I'm out of here. Peace.